The night was silent, but Ethan Carter knew better. Silence was never a good sign. He sat in the corner of a dimly lit safe house, his back against the cold wooden wall. His breath was steady, but his mind raced. Max, his loyal German shepherd, lay beside him, ears twitching at the slightest sound. The dog could sense it too, danger was coming. Outside, the sky stretched in endless darkness over a small, forgotten town, the kind of place where secrets could be buried, but not for long. The roads were empty, the streetlights flickering weakly. The world seemed asleep. But Ethan knew they were out there. Then, it came. The low, distant roar of motorcycle engines. A deep rumble, growing louder by the second. The iron fangs. Ethan clenched his fists. Dax Miller was leading them. Ruthless. Cold. The man never let anything slip through his fingers, and Ethan had stolen something priceless. His hand instinctively went to his jacket pocket, feeling the small USB drive inside. It held the kind of evidence that could bring the entire gang down, illegal deals, names, corrupt officers in their pocket. If it got into the right hands, Dax's empire would crumble. But first, Ethan had to survive the night. Max let out a low growl. The motorcycles were close now. Headlights cut through the window cracks like knife slashes in the dark. Ethan grabbed his backpack, his gun, and looked at Max. No more running. But no room for mistakes either. Then, the sound of boots hitting the ground. The hunt had begun. The safe house was old and fragile, its wooden walls too thin to withstand what was coming. Ethan had minutes, maybe less. He moved fast, pushing a shelf in front of the door. It wouldn't stop them, but it would buy a little time. Outside, the iron fangs were spreading out. The motorcycles had stopped. Now, only silence. That was worse. Max's ears perked up, his body tense. Ethan grabbed his gun but knew he couldn't fight an entire gang alone. He needed an escape. His eyes darted around the small room until they landed on the floorboards. The tunnel. The previous owner had built a hidden escape tunnel, probably for bootlegging in the old days. Ethan had checked it earlier, cramped, dark, but his only option. A loud bang rattled the door. They were here. Ethan yanked the loose floorboard up, revealing a narrow passage beneath. "Come on, Max," he whispered. The dog hesitated only a second before slipping into the darkness. Ethan followed, pulling the board back into place just as the door burst open. Boots stomped inside. Voices cursed. "Where is he?" Dax's voice. Cold. Sharp. Ethan held his breath. The tunnel was tight, barely enough room to move. He crawled forward, hands pressing against damp earth. Max led the way, silent, trained. Then, a noise ahead. Ethan froze. A faint scuff of boots against the dirt. Someone was inside the tunnel. Dax had anticipated this. A flashlight flickered at the far end. Shadows shifted. Two figures. Waiting. The trap was set. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as the two men closed in on him. The tunnel was barely wide enough for him to move, and there was no room for mistakes. He had to act fast, or he and Max would be trapped. The first figure stepped closer, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Ethan's muscles tensed, every instinct screaming for action. He moved in one swift motion, silently taking down the first attacker with a precise punch to the throat. The man dropped without a sound, his flashlight clattering to the ground. The second attacker turned, hearing the scuffle. But before he could react, Max lunged from the shadows. His teeth sank deep into the man's arm, and a strangled cry broke the silence. Max shook his head violently, forcing the man to fall to the ground, immobilized. Ethan didn't wait. "Good boy, Max," he whispered as he grabbed the fallen biker's gun. He didn't need to kill, he just needed to survive. The gang was close now, too close. Ethan dragged Max through the narrow passage, his dog limping beside him. The sounds of footsteps above them were growing louder, but they couldn't stop. The darkness of the tunnel felt like a suffocating weight, but it was their only hope. They emerged from the tunnel and into the cold forest. The night air hit them like a slap. Max staggered, his injured leg dragging behind. Ethan's breath came in quick gasps as he looked back. There were no signs of the gang yet, but he could hear them getting closer. The rumble of motorcycles echoed through the trees. Max's leg was slowing them down, but the dog refused to stop. He kept pushing forward, his loyalty unwavering. Ethan knew he couldn't afford to slow down either. If they didn't find cover soon, they would be out of options. Every rustling leaf and crack of a twig made his heart race. The forest was dense and dark, but it was still their best chance. He glanced at Max, whose eyes were filled with determination. They had come this far, they couldn't give up now. But the gang wasn't far behind. Ethan heard them getting closer, their motorcycles roaring again. They needed shelter. And fast. Ethan's eyes scanned the darkness as he pushed deeper into the forest, Max limping beside him. The sound of motorcycles grew louder, but they were still too far to be a threat. Ethan needed shelter, a safe place to regroup, to think, and to figure out what to do next. Ahead, through the trees, he saw a broken-down ranger station, hidden in the shadows. It was an old structure, abandoned years ago, but it was their best bet. Ethan led Max to the station, his steps quick but cautious. They reached the door, which hung loosely on its hinges. With a grunt, Ethan shoved it open. The room inside was dusty, filled with the scent of decay and disuse. But it would do. He immediately went to the far corner of the room and set up a small barricade with broken wood. He couldn't risk being caught off guard. As the door creaked shut behind him, Ethan pulled out his laptop and the USB drive. His fingers flew over the keys as he plugged in the drive. He had to know why Dax and his gang were so desperate to get their hands on it. He opened the files, one by one, his eyes scanning the data. The truth hit him like a punch to the gut. The gang wasn't just involved in smuggling, they were deeply tied to a massive human trafficking operation. There were names, dates, locations, all of it leading back to high-level law enforcement officials. The most shocking name of all? Ryan Maddox. Ethan's blood ran cold. Maddox had been a trusted ally, someone who had helped him in the past. But now, his name was connected to this nightmare. Before Ethan could process the full scope of the operation, he heard it, footsteps outside. His pulse quickened. There was no time. He quickly shut down the laptop and grabbed his gun. Max growled softly beside him, his ears alert. Ethan motioned for him to stay quiet. Through the cracks in the walls, Ethan saw two figures approaching, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. They were searching for him. The Iron Fangs had found them. Ethan's mind raced. He needed a plan, something fast. He noticed a gas canister by the back wall, used for the station's heating system. His eyes lit up with a dangerous idea. He grabbed the canister and rigged a makeshift fuse using whatever he could find, rags, a piece of wire, and some old matches. He placed the canister near the door and lit the fuse, then ducked behind a wooden beam, holding Max close. The seconds felt like hours. The door creaked open. The two bikers entered, unaware of the trap. Ethan's heart raced. Just a little longer. Then, the explosion. The boom shook the entire building. The door blew off its hinges, sending the bikers flying backward. They scrambled, coughing and shouting in pain, but they were momentarily disoriented. Ethan didn't waste a second. He grabbed Max, bolted through the back window, and disappeared into the woods, the noise of the explosion still ringing in his ears. For a moment, the chaos gave him the edge. But the night was far from over. Ethan and Max pushed forward, their steps slowing with every passing minute. The weight of the night was starting to drag them down, exhaustion creeping in like a shadow. Max was limping more now, his injuries worsening with every step. As they trudged deeper into the forest, Ethan's eyes scanned the landscape, searching for a place to rest. His breath came in short gasps, but he couldn't afford to slow down for long. He had to find a temporary safe spot, a place where they could regroup and figure out their next move. In the distance, through the trees, he spotted a small, dilapidated cabin. It looked abandoned, but it was solid enough to offer some protection for the night. Ethan quickened his pace, urging Max forward. They reached the cabin, and Ethan carefully pushed open the creaky door. The inside was dark and musty, with dust covering every surface. But it was shelter. It was their only chance to catch their breath. Ethan immediately went to work tending to Max's wounds. He pulled out a first aid kit, his hands moving quickly as he cleaned and bandaged the dog's injuries. Max lay still, his breathing slow but steady, his loyalty unwavering despite the pain. Once Max was taken care of, Ethan turned his attention to the USB drive. The files had revealed far more than he could have anticipated. The corruption went deeper than just Dax and his gang. Ryan Maddox was at the center of it all, someone Ethan had trusted. The implications were enormous, and the deeper Ethan dug, the more dangerous it became. As he studied the files, his mind raced. Maddox's involvement wasn't just a betrayal, it was a key to bringing down an entire network of criminal operations, with law enforcement officials playing a part in it all. The fight wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about justice. But then, a sound interrupted his thoughts, footsteps. Someone was approaching. Ethan tensed, his hand instinctively going to his gun. He motioned for Max to stay quiet as the sound of footsteps grew closer. Was it the gang? He had to be ready. Ethan's grip tightened on the gun as he stood near the window, his eyes narrowing at the figure approaching. Ryan Maddox. The man who had been at the center of Ethan's entire investigation. The man who had been both ally and enemy. Maddox stopped a few feet from the cabin, his hands raised in surrender. His eyes met Ethan's, calm and calculating. "I'm not here to fight," Maddox called out, his voice steady but low. "I'm here to talk." Ethan didn't lower his gun. He couldn't afford to trust anyone, especially someone like Maddox. He kept his eyes locked on him, waiting for the next move. "You're wasting your time," Ethan said coldly, his finger poised on the trigger. "What do you want?" Maddox took a step forward, his gaze never leaving Ethan. "You don't understand," he said, his voice laced with urgency. "The Iron Fangs, they're just a distraction. The real problem is much bigger than you think." Ethan's brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" "The gang, the trafficking operation, it's only the surface. There's a much darker force behind it all. If you don't stop it now, it will destroy everything. Your career, your life, everything you've worked for." Ethan's mind raced. Maddox's words made no sense. Was this just another lie? Was Maddox trying to manipulate him to cover his tracks? "I'm not buying it," Ethan said, his voice hard. "You've been lying to me this entire time." Maddox's face remained stoic, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something Ethan couldn't quite read. "I'm telling you the truth," Maddox insisted. "You're too deep in this now. You've made enemies that you can't even imagine. The only way out is to stop them before they destroy you." Ethan didn't lower his gun. Max stood beside him, his body tense and ready, his instincts as sharp as ever. Ethan glanced at Max, his dog's unwavering focus on Maddox telling him everything he needed to know. Max didn't trust Maddox. Ethan exhaled slowly, trying to weigh his options. His mind told him to stay cautious, to keep his distance. But something in Maddox's demeanor, the calmness in his voice, made Ethan hesitate. Maybe there was something to what he was saying. Maybe this wasn't just about survival, it was about something much bigger. The air between them was thick with tension. Ethan's eyes flicked back to Maddox, then to Max. The decision was made. "You've got 5 minutes," Ethan said, lowering his gun just slightly. Maddox didn't move, his hand still raised in a gesture of peace. This conversation would either be the beginning of the end or the final trap. Ethan's pulse raced as he waited for Maddox's next words. Ethan's mind raced, his fingers still gripping the gun, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Maddox's offer was tempting, inside knowledge that could bring down the gang and dismantle the operation from the inside. But trust was something Ethan couldn't give easily. Max stood firm beside him, his ears alert, eyes locked on Maddox. The dog didn't trust him, and neither did Ethan. But time was running out. The Iron Fangs were closing in. He could hear the motorcycles in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. "You're running out of time, Ethan," Maddox said, his voice urgent but calm. "The gang's closing in. You can't fight them alone. If you want to take them down for good, you need my help." Ethan's pulse quickened. Every instinct told him to run, to get away from this man who had betrayed him before. But something about Maddox's words rang true. The stakes were too high. If he ran, they'd be hunted forever, and the truth would remain hidden. Maddox's next words were clear. "I know everything. I've been inside their operation. If you help me, I'll help you take them down." Ethan's hand shook as he thought about it. He had no choice. This was the only chance they had. The gang wasn't just a threat to him anymore, they were a threat to everything Ethan stood for. He turned to Max, whose eyes mirrored his uncertainty. The dog trusted Ethan, and in that moment, that's all Ethan needed. "All right," Ethan said, lowering his gun slowly. "We're in. But if you double-cross me, I swear." "I won't," Maddox interrupted, holding up his hands. "This is bigger than both of us now." The deal was made, and as they turned to prepare, the sound of motorcycles got closer. Danger was everywhere, but together, they had a chance. Ethan, Max, and Maddox were about to take on the enemy from within. The Iron Fangs arrived at the cabin like a storm, their bikes roaring through the trees. Ethan's heart raced as he, Max, and Maddox quickly took positions. The cabin was their last line of defense. "We have to hold them off until we get the evidence out," Ethan said, his voice steady but filled with tension. Maddox nodded, his eyes hardening. "We fight together, or we don't fight at all." The first biker burst through the door, his gun drawn. Ethan was ready. He dove to the side, narrowly avoiding a shot that splintered the wood beside him. Max was right behind him, lunging at the biker's legs, knocking him off balance. Ethan took the opportunity and disarmed him, knocking him out cold. Outside, the gang's leader, Dax, led the charge, his voice echoing through the trees. "Find them. They can't escape." The cabin was under siege, but Ethan didn't flinch. He was focused, more than ever. He moved to the back of the cabin, where the USB drive was safely stored in his bag. Maddox was covering him, using his knowledge of the gang's tactics to outsmart them. Ethan plugged the USB into his laptop, his fingers flying across the keys. The files uploaded, revealing everything, proof of the human trafficking operation, the corruption in law enforcement, and the ties between the Iron Fangs and high-level officials. "Get ready," Ethan said as he hit the send button. A loud crash from the front door signaled the gang's final push. Dax was close. The files were sent out to the world, but now they had to survive the attack. The law enforcement arrived just in time, sirens wailing in the distance. The gang didn't have time to react before they were surrounded. Dax and his men were arrested, but it wasn't over yet. Ethan knew that. The real fight had only just begun. The file spread like wildfire. The truth was out. Ethan Carter, with the help of Maddox and Max, had exposed the entire corrupt system. Law enforcement agents who had been working with the gang were arrested, and the human trafficking operation was shut down. The world watched as the story unfolded. News outlets broadcasted the evidence, and social media erupted with outrage. People demanded justice, and they got it. The Iron Fangs were no longer a shadow in the night, they were a thing of the past. But the battle didn't stop there. Ethan knew this was just the first step. The corruption ran deep, far beyond the gang, reaching into government and the criminal underworld. The fight for justice would take time, but the first victory was theirs. Maddox, though part of the enemy, had turned over even more evidence. His knowledge, combined with Ethan's determination, was enough to make sure real change would come. The gears of justice were turning. As Ethan sat back, watching the news unfold, he knew that he and Max had made a difference. They had taken down one of the biggest threats this country had seen, but the journey wasn't over. Ethan and Max were ready for what came next. They weren't just survivors anymore, they were fighters for justice. And no matter where the next chapter took them, they'd face it together.